In this video, I will teach you how to build a simple authentication system using PHP and Mysql. Now, in order to begin, we need to actually install XAMPP, as we're going to be using XAMPP to run our PHP files and database. And also, I want you to note that if you would want to get the code for this entire project, there's going to be a link in the description that will take you to the GitHub repository where this code will be present. So the next thing that we need to do is make sure that XAMPP is installed if you don't already have it. So you can come to this link. There's going to be a link in the description that will bring you to this. Or if you don't want to, this is the link. If you don't want to check the description, you could just open a new tab and type download XAMPP and click the first link that comes up. Now, once you get to this page, just select download XAMPP for whatever operating system. Since I already have it installed, there's no need for me to install it. I'm just going to close out these tabs. So now that we have it installed, the next step is that we need to run XAMPP itself. So if you're on a Mac, I want you to come to your Finder and go to your application section. Now, once you're in your application section, just scroll down all the way to where you have XAMPP. Now, I'm going to assume that at this point you have already installed XAMPP. You've downloaded it and installed it already on your computer. So once you've installed it on your Mac, it's probably going to be in the applications folder. So just scroll all the way down to where you have XAMPP and open the folder. Now, I'm also going to show you how to find this folder in Windows, but just follow with me. So once you click XAMPP, just open htdocs. Now it is inside this directory where we are going to create our projects folder. Now, if you are on a Windows machine and you are trying to look for this folder, there's going to be a picture that will show up right now on the screen that is going to show you where you can find your XAMPP folder. Now, once you find it, just open the XAMPP folder and go to the folder called htdocs. So now that we're in htdocs, what we need to do is we need to create a projects directory inside htdocs. Now, I had already created a projects directory and I called it authentication, but you can create yours and call it whatever you want. It's also important to note that I had opened this authentication directory inside my Visual Studio. I'm just going to open it here in my Finder also. Now, you notice that there are 3 files in the folder. We have the index.php, Login.php, and Register.php. Since this is an authentication tutorial, I already have just this starter code that I had just written. Like, this is just a login page with and a register page also, which has a register form. And there's also a static a CSS file, which just helps to style my register and login pages. So this is just like the boilerplate code that I have. If you would like to follow exactly with me, like step by step, and you want to work with these exact starter files, there's going to be a link in the description that will take you to the repository where you can get these files. The link is just going to be starter files : the link to where you can get these files. So now that we have our projects folder created and we have opened it in our code editor, which could be VS Code or any other code editor, the next thing that we need to do in order to actually run these PHP files is we need to run XAMPP. So how do you run XAMPP? If you are on a Mac, just click Launchpad. And once you click Launchpad, I want you to look for this XAMPP icon over here. This could be, it's probably in the second section or wherever section where the latest apps get installed in. So I want you to just click here, XAMPP. And once you open it, you have this other icon called Manager OSX. So just open that and you need to enter your password. I'm just going to enter my password. Now, once I click that, it's going to bring up this window for me. If you are on a Windows machine and you don't know how to open XAMPP, I want you to just press your Windows icon and search for XAMPP. Now, it's probably going to pop up. Once it pops up, click it and it should open. So the next thing that we need to do is, for the Mac users, I want you to click Manage Servers. And once you click Manage Servers, all these are probably saying stopped also. So what I want you to do is, I want you to click on Apache Web Server and click Start. and I want you to, oh yeah, or we could just start everything. So once you click start all, it's just starts everything, starts the MySQL database. We need this because we actually are going to create a database where we are going to be storing user information like username, email, password, and all that. And we also need the Apache web server in order to help us run our PHP files web. We don't really need this one, but we might as well just run it. So if you're on the Windows, all you need to do is just run Apache and MySQL database. You are good to go. So now that we have XAMPP running, what we simply need to do is we need to go to, I'm just going to go to my Firefox browser over here, and I will create a new tab and just type localhost / whatever the name of your project folder was. Since mine is authentication, I'm just going to say localhost / authentication. Now, once I visit localhost / authentication, it automatically goes and grabs this index.php file, because usually when you visit a URL like this, it usually looks for the index.php file first. So if I want to see the login and register pages now, I can just say / login.php, and then this is how my login page looks like. And if I go to my register, it says username, email, password, and confirm password. So these are the pages that I had just had by default inside my project folder. So the next step that we need to take is we need to create a database. So I want you to go create a new tab and go to localhost / php my main. So once you, let me just zoom in here. So once you go to this URL, it's just going to show you this admin dashboard. And what we really need to just do here is we need to create a new database. So go over to databases, and then in here, we're going to create a new database. So what I'm just going to call this database is authentication, or I'm just going to call it auth for short. And then just leave this as it is and don't change it. So just click create. Now once you click create, it's going to create a new database for us called auth. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a database table called users, because we actually need to create a table where we can store user information and user data. So I want you to select auth and then click SQL. So we're going to be writing some SQL code that is going to help us create this table inside the database. So let me just zoom in here. Okay, let me zoom in here so you can see it properly. Okay, so I want you to type, make sure that all this is in uppercase, by the way. Create table, and then what table do we want to create? We want to create a table called users. Now note that we can't say create table user because user is already like a default keyword in SQL. So that is why we are saying users. And then we need to open parentheses and put a semicolon at the end. So after doing that, the first thing that we need to define is an ID. Every single user has to have an ID. I'm going to create the entry and I'll call it ID. And it's going to be an integer. I'm just going to pass in 11 here. Means it can store a maximum of 11 digits. And then I'm going to specify that this field cannot be empty. So I'm going to say not null. And the next thing I'll say is auto increment. What exactly does this line mean? We specified a new item or a new column and we called it ID. Now we're declaring that this is an integer. That is a data type of type int. So it's going to be storing, this column is going to be storing integer values. Now, we also said that it cannot be empty by saying not null. That is, we can't create a user object or we can't create a user in a database that does not have an ID. And then auto increment simply means that anytime a new user gets created, we just want to get the last ID of, we want to get the ID of the last user that was created. And we want to increment that number, assign it to this new user so that we don't have to manually do it ourselves. SQL just manually increments this user ID for us and sets it. So the next thing that we need to specify is the username. I'm going to say username, and this is going to be a varchar. And we're going to store 30 in there, 30 characters. And we're also going to say this is not null. So we're just trying to store the username using varchar, and then we're saying that this can only store a maximum of 30 characters. Now we're going to do the same for email. I'm going to say email is also going to be a varchar, and then it's going to store, let's just say 30 characters also. And then this is also going to be not null. And then the next field that we need to specify is the password. I'm just going to call this pwd, because if I try to say password, you notice that it's already a keyword. I'm going to leave it as pwd. And then this is going to be a varchar also. And then let's just say we want to store about 100 characters. Because let's say, for example, a user wants to put in a password of length 100. Let's just put it for the sake of this tutorial. And then we're going to say this is also going to be not null. And then the next field that we need to specify is created at. That is, when was this user created? When was this new user inserted into the database? Now this is going to be a date time column. So this is going to be a date time. And then we're going to say this is also not null. And then we need to give it a default value, because every time a new user is created, we want to say, okay, we want to assign the created at column the specific time that this user was created. So we're just saying that anytime a new user is created, we want you to save the time that it was created and assign it to this created at column right here. So I'm just going to say not null. Default is, I'm going to say the default is current time. And then the last thing that we need to say is primary key. Now notice that I'm going to explain this. I'm going to say primary key, then we're going to pass in ID. So what we're just simply saying here is that the ID which every user has is a unique number, and no other user can have an ID that has been created before. So let's say, for example, we have two users. The first user has an ID of 1 and the second user has an ID of 2. The two users can never have the same ID of 1. And then we're saying primary key because we're trying to say that this specific ID is unique to every single user that's created and saved in the database. So now all we simply need to do is we just need to scroll down and we need to click go. So once you click go, it's going to create a new table, as you can see on the right. And when we click it, you'll notice that it's empty right now. Obviously, it's empty because we don't have any user that exists in the database. So we just see that it has a column of ID, username, email, password, and created at. So right now we have been able to successfully create our database. Now the next thing is that we need to go to our PHP project, and we need to actually connect to this database so that we can be able to create and save users into it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new folder and call it includes. Now inside this includes folder, I will create a file and call it db.php. So it is inside this file that we are going to be making the connection to our database. So what I'm just simply going to do here is I'm going to create a PHP opening tag. Now I'm also going to assume that you have the basic knowledge of PHP. So there are some things that I won't be explaining because I expect that you understand some of these specific things. So now, after opening the PHP tag, I'm going to declare a few variables. The first one I'm going to declare is host, and I'm going to equate that to localhost. Now I'm going to explain why we are doing this, but just follow with me. So after declaring host, the next thing that I will declare is db name. Now equate that to the name of the name that we give our database. I called mine auth, so just make sure you pass in whatever database name you give your database. I'm going to pass in auth. The next thing that we need to define is the username. So I'm going to say db username. Now we quiz that to root. And then the next thing is we need to define db password. Now we quiz that to an empty string. Now we're just trying to declare a few variables at the top that is going to help us connect to the database. So what we're now simply going to do now is create a try and catch block. I'm going to explain why we're doing this. So let me just do this. So now inside this try block, what we want to do is we want to try and connect to the database. But if for any reason we don't know or we get an error, we want to catch that error inside this catch block and display the error. So that is why we are creating a try and catch block. So we're going to be connecting the database by using PDO, which stands for PHP data object. So it just helps us to connect to the database and perform some queries on the database. So you are going to see how it's going to work as we continue building on. So I'll create a new variable and I'll call it PDO, and I will equate it to a new PDO. Now open parenthesis right here. I'll put my semicolon. So we need to pass in these specific values that we have, these values that we had specified at the top. We need to pass it into this new PDO class that we just created because we want to connect to the database. So the first thing that I'm going to say is my SQL colon host, because we're trying to connect to and my SQL database. And then we're going to say colon host is equals to $host. So we're trying to say, okay, the host of this database, the host is equals to the host that we created here, which is localhost. Now we're saying localhost because our database is currently running on, it's running on localhost. And that is where our project is also going to be running on. So after saying localhost, the next thing that we need to define is we need to define the DB name. So I'm going to say DB name is equals to $DB name. After specifying the DB name, the next thing that we need to specify is the username and the password. So I am just going to put a comma right here, and then we need to pass in DB username and DB password. So after specifying those values, DB username and DB password, what we simply now need to do is we need to go down. So as at this line here right now, we have written a new PDO class, which is going to help us connect to the database. But what if an error occurs? We want to throw that error in the next line so that we're going to catch that error in the catch block. Now I'm going to show you how we're going to do this. So we're going to say $PDO, and then we're going to call a method called set attribute. Now inside this set attribute, we're going to pass in a parameter. We're going to pass in something. We're going to say PDO :attr error mode. Then we're going to say comma PDO error mode underscore exception. So what we're simply doing here is that we're saying, okay, try to connect to this database that we have created. But if there is an error, we want to throw that error right here. So what set attribute does is that it just sets the error handling mode for the PDO instance that we have created here, so that we can throw exceptions when an error occurs. So now that we're throwing an error here, if any error occurs, what we want to do is we want to catch that error inside the catch block. So I am going to come down here inside the catch block and I'll say catch PDO exception. Then I'm going to put $E right here so that we're passing the error to E right here. So what we now simply need to do is we're just going to die. That is, we're going to kill it, and then we're going to say die, and then we're going to pass in error connection failed, or no, instead of saying error, let me just close this, clean this. And I'll say connection failed with error, and I'll put colon, and in here I'll just put full stop, then $E, and I'll call the method of get message. So what we've done here now is that we have successfully connected to our database. We created a few variables at the top and assigned them to values like the host, DB name, DB username, and DB password. And then we created try and catch blocks. In the try block, we created a new PDO instance to help us connect to our database, which we are just creating. And then we are calling the method search attribute in order to throw an error if any error actually exists, or if you got any error from trying to connect to the database. Let's say, for example, wrong username, wrong password, or wrong host. This could cause errors. So we want to throw an error from this line if an error occurs. Then in the catch block, we just want to catch the error that has been thrown of PDO exception, and then we're representing it with $E. So if anything, if any error occurs, we now want to catch the error. Then we want to say die. So this is just going to exit the entire program entirely, almost like killing it. So like die, and then it's going to give us an error message of connection failed with error. And then we're saying $E and calling the get message. We're calling the get message method so that we can actually see the message or see the reason why the error occurred. So in this next section, we need to make sure that we have some specific things inside the Register.php file. If I go to that file right now, this is it. So let me just zoom out. So this is the file right now, my Register.php file. So it just has the username field, email, password, and confirm password. But we need to make sure that some specific things are present. What we need to do is make sure that the name attribute is present in every single input field. Because using this name attribute, when we submit the form, we are going to use it to grab whatever the user enters inside each field. We're going to use this name attribute as like a unique identifier to grab whatever the user has entered in all the fields. Now, I'll show you how this works. So just make sure that your input fields have a name attribute. For example, my username field has a name of username, email has that of email, password has that of password, and confirm password has that of confirm_password. So just make sure that you have all these inside your project. So right now, what we need to do is make sure that we give this form an action. That is, when this form is submitted, where do we want all that data to be sent to? So what I want you to type is includes /register register-user.php. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create this file called register-user.php inside the includes folder. So I want you to just create a new file and call it register-user.php. So when this form is submitted, all that data is going to be sent via post method to this form, to this PHP file. So also make sure that your form has a method of post, because we are trying to send this data to this file through a post request. So I'm just going to enter this file and I'm going to create open a PHP tag. Now the first thing that we need to do inside this file is we need to check for an incoming post request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write an if, and then I'll say if $_server, and I'm going to say request request method is equals to post. So what exactly does this mean? In PHP, if you want to check for an incoming, if you want to check if there's an incoming post request, what you just do is you use the _server, and then in here you put in request method. So we're just trying to say, okay, if the request that is currently coming in is a post request, then let's execute whatever is inside this if block. So we need to write an else also, because the only reason why a user should visit this page is if they are trying to sign up. And the only way they visit this page is if they have filled this register form and they are being redirected here, and their data is being sent here because of the action that we had specified inside the form. That is the only way a user should visit this file, through a post request. So if it wasn't a post request, we're just going to redirect the person back to the register page. So I'm going to say header, and I'll say location : I'm going to explain this, register.php. So what we're saying here is, okay, if it wasn't the post request that came in, we want to redirect this person to the register.php page. But you might be wondering why I put dot slash. The reason why I put it is because the register-user.php, the register user file is currently inside an includes directory. And then we need to note that the register.php file is inside the base directory of this project. So when we say dot slash, it means we want to go back one directory and then reference whatever file that comes after. So by saying dot slash, it means we go to the authentication directory. If I open it, it means we go from includes into the authentication directory, and then it's / register.php. So we're referencing register.php file. So if a post request doesn't come in, they get redirected back to this page. So what we now want to do is, after we've checked if a post request is coming in, we now want to grab all the data that the user had entered inside this place. And in order to grab that, we need to make use of this name attribute. This is where the name attributes come in handy. So in order to grab the username, we know that it has a name attribute of username. I'm going to come here and create a new variable, and I'll call it username, and I will equate it to a $_post. So this is how to get the data from a post request. So $_post, and I'll pass in username. I'm passing in username again because it was the name attribute that we gave, or that I gave the username input field. So we need to do the same for email, password, and confirm password. I'm just going to copy this and paste it 3 times. And I'll call this one email, call this one password, and I'll call this one confirm password. Just make sure that whatever values you are passing into this square bracket, just make sure that it matches name attributes that you had given your input fields. So confirm password, email, and username. I can see it, they all match. Confirm password, email, and username. So now that we have gotten what the user has imputed into that form, we can't just save this data directly to the database. Obviously, we need to do some validation on this data. Now, the few things that we are going to need to check is that we want to check and make sure that the user filled all the fields. For example, we want to make sure that the user entered the username, email, password, and confirm password. Now I know you can do this with, you can make this functionality with like JavaScript, but I just want to show you how to do it in PHP. And also, as we're doing this validation, I'm going to show you how we can build like a little error message displaying system that we're going to be using to inform the user. Like, for example, your password is too short, this username already exists, and errors like that. So we're going to be checking for, I think, 5 things. We're going to check to first make sure that the user entered all the fields, filled all the fields. That is, entered the username, email, and password. We also want to check to make sure that the confirmed password and the confirmed password match each other. We also want to check if the password is less than 5 characters. That is, passwords that users create cannot be less than 5 characters. That is the minimum. And then we want to check if the email that they are using to register and the username that they are using to register, we want to check if these two already exist in the database. And if they exist, we want to inform the user that error, you can't create an account with this username or this password because they already exist. So what I am going to do right now is I'm going to come over to my includes folder, and I will create a new file called validator.php. Now, inside this validator.php, we are going to create a custom class called validate, and this is going to just help us validate all the perform all the validation that we need on this data. So I'm just going to create a PHP tag here, and I'll come down, and I'm going to create a class, and I'll call it validate. And I'm just going to do that. Now, I'm not going to write anything inside this class for now. But what we need to do is that we need to import this class into this register-user.php so that we can use it. So I'm just going to come down here and type require_once, and then we want to reference this validator.php file because we would like to make use of this validate class. I'm going to say require once validator.php. Now, once you do that, once you type that, just save it and come over to the validator.php page. So what we need to do is we need to pass in all these values. That is the username, email, password, and confirm password. We're going to pass all those values to this class to do the validation for us. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create private private attributes, private variables inside this class. So I'm just going to create the first one. It's going to be private and it's going to be called username. And then the next one is going to be private email. The next one is going to be private password. Oops, I messed that up. It's supposed to be private and then password. And the last item is going to be private. And this is going to be called confirm password. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a constructor in this class so that when we call the validate class inside the register.user.php file, we are just going to pass in all these values by default into the validate class. So it serves as like, so the constructor is just going to help us pass all those values to these variables that we have just created at the top. So I will just go ahead to create the constructor now. And I'm going to say function __ construct. Now, inside this constructor, we're going to pass in all the values that we will be needing in order to perform all this verification or validation. Now, we need to create one last private variable. And I'm going to explain why we are doing this, but it's going to be private and then we're going to say PDO. So we need to collect all the values that this constructor is now going to use in order to save it to this attributes these variables at the top, or values I mean. But before we do that, we need to come down at the top. We need to go to the top of this file and we need to declare something. We need to say declare, and I'm going to say strict types is equals to 1. So the reason why we are doing this is because we want to make sure that whatever values that are passed to this class must be specifically whatever values, we want to make sure that whatever values that are passed into this class must match the data types which are specified. So I'm going to explain. Now, we know that username is going to be a string, email is going to be a string, password and confirm password are also going to be strings, but PDO is going to be an object, and you are going to see why it's an object in the long run, but just follow with me. So what we now simply need to do is ensure that these values are passed to the constructor as strings. If they aren't passed as strings, this strict types is going to throw an error. It's going to say that, hey, this constructor expected that you passed in these specific data types. So if a data type doesn't match whatever value, if a value doesn't match whatever data type was specified, it's going to give an error. So in here, I'm going to say the first thing that we're passing in is a string, and it's going to be username. And then the next thing is a string. And then this is going to be email. The next thing is also a string, and this is going to be password. The next one is a string also. It's going to be confirm. Let me just close this. Confirm password. And then the last one is going to be an object. And this is going to be PDO. So I'm going to explain why we are passing this object PDO eventually, but I want you to just follow with me. So in this constructor, we're now going to assign these values to the class, to the attributes of the class. So I'm going to say this username is equals to username. I'm also going to say this of email is equals to email. So I'll do this exact same thing 3 times, but instead this one is going to be password. This is going to be confirm password, and this last one is going to be PDO. So after creating the constructor in this class, the next thing that we need to do is we now need to write the actual function that is going to help us perform the validation on this data. I'm going to create a new function and I'm going to call it validates data. And then it's just going to be a class method. So inside this method, the first thing that we need to do is create an array. Now inside this array, we are going to be storing all the errors that we encounter during this validation. I'm going to call it errors, RRORS. Now we equate this to an empty array. So when we put square brackets, this just means that this is an array. So we're going to go ahead and write some code that's going to perform the validation. And if we encounter any error, we're going to store it inside this errors array. Now, I am going to teach you how we can render these errors and display them to the user so that they can make the changes that they need to make. So the first error that we need to check for is to ensure that the user entered all the fields. That is, we want to make sure the user entered the username, email, password, and confirm password. I'm going to write an if statement for that. I'm going to say if empty. Now empty is an inbuilt method that we can use in order to check if whatever we pass in as a parameter is an actual value or is empty. So I'm going to say if empty of this, and I'm going to use the function this username. So when I say this arrow dash username, I'm just trying to reference the username attribute of this class. So I'm going to say if empty of username or empty, or I'm going to say this email or empty of this password, and I'm going to say or empty of this. I'm going to put confirm password right there. I'm just going to create my parentheses right here. So if any of these fields are empty, if the username field is empty, or the email field is empty, or the password or the confirm password, what we want to do is we want to create a new error and save it to this error array. I'm going to say errors, and in here I'm going to explain what we are doing, and in here I'm going to name this error on complete form, and I'm going to equate this error to please fill all the fields. I think it's supposed to be incomplete. So what we are simply doing here is that we are trying to create a new error, and then we're trying to insert it into this array. So when I say errors of incomplete form, what this means is that this is going to be an associative array. So it's going to be like we're storing a key and a value. So incomplete form is going to be a key, and then please fill out all the fields is going to be the actual value that we're storing as the error. So it's an associative array. So you are going to see how we're going to render this error out to the user when the user makes this mistake. So the next thing that we need to check for after making sure that the user enters after making sure to check if the user entered all the fields is that we need to check if the password and confirm password match each other. So I'm going to write another if. I'm going to say if if the password, it is supposed to be this, if password is not equals to this of confirm password, that is, if these passwords do not match, then it means there is an error. I'm going to create a new error. I'm going to say errors, and the key for this is going to be, let me make this lowercase instead. The key for this is going to be password match error, and this is going to be equal to I'm just going to equate this to passwords do not match. So if for any reason the user mistakenly enters password and confirm password and they do not match, it's going to display an error saying, or it's going to save an error saying passwords do not match. Okay, so the next thing that we need to check for is to make sure that the password that the user entered is greater than 5 characters. So I'm going to write another if for this. So I'm going to say if the length, and there's an inbuilt function called strlen, which helps us check the length of strings. I'm going to say if the length of this password is less than 5, then it means there is an error because we want the passwords that the user enter to be greater than 5 characters. And I'm going to create a new error. I'm going to say errors, and I'll say password short or password too short. And the error message is going to be passwords must be greater than or equal to 5 characters. Now this is supposed to be equals to. Okay. So if the password is less than 5 characters, an error is going to display it saying passwords must be greater than or equal to 5 characters. Let me just make this password instead of passwords. Okay, so next we need to verify if the email that the user entered is actually a valid email address. Now, the way we do this is by using an inbuilt method. What I'm going to do is I'm going to write an if condition. Now, it's inside this if condition that I'm going to check to see if the email is valid. So I'm going to say if filter var, filter underscore var, and in here, the first thing that I'm going to pass in is the actual email. I'm going to say this and then email. And the next thing is I need to specify what kind of filtering that I want to do. I'm going to say filter validate email. So what this just does is that it takes this email and it validates it to see if it is actually a valid email that was entered. So the filter var is an inbuilt method. And if you're using VS Code, you can just press command if you're on a Mac and then hover over it and click it, and it's going to open this function directly for us in the code editor. So right now, what do we want to do if this is a valid email? Originally, when I started, I said I want to check if it is not a valid email. So what I can say is I can say if not filter var and then this email and filter validate email. So we're saying that if this is not a valid email that is being filtered, then we want to create a new error, and we're saying errors, and in here I'm just going to call it invalid email, and I'm going to equate it to a message of please enter a valid email address. So right now we've written some code to validate if all the fields are entered, if the password matches, if the password is less than 5 characters, and then we also check to see if the email that was entered is a valid email address. Now the next thing that we need to do is we now actually need to check if the username and the email that this person is trying to register with already exists in the database. So we want to give an error for that. You know how if you go to Facebook or Instagram and you try to create an account, if a user with that specific username or that email that you're using to register already exists, it shows them an error saying that this username already exists in database, because usernames are supposed to be unique to every specific user. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm first going to create a new file inside the includes directory, and I'm going to call it user-models.php. Now, inside this file, we are going to be writing some SQL queries that's just going to be carrying out some operations for us inside our database. But before we do that, let's head back to our validate class. Now, we are going to create two functions that check if the username already exists in database and if the email already exists in database. So what I'm going to do right now is that I'm going to come to my user-models.php file and I'll create my PHP tag. So what we're first going to do is we are going to create a function. Now this function is going to attempt to search the database to see if a user with a specific username exists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function and I'll call it get underscore user username. I'll call it get user username. And in here, it's just going to take in two parameters. It's going to take in an object of PDO, and it's going to take in a string of username. Now, at the top of this file also, we also need to declare that we are going to be using strict types. And then we're going to equate this to 1 because we want to ensure here that we're using specifically strict types, and I'm going to explain why we are doing this. So inside this function, what do we want to do? What we want to do is that we want to write an SQL query that is going to go to the database and check to see if a user with this specific username, which we are going to pass, exists in database. So we're going to call this get user username function from our validator class. And if we get anything back in return, then it means that a user with that username already exists. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to write a query. I'm going to create a variable first, and I'll call it query. And I'm going to equate this to an SQL query. Now I am going to say select star. I'm going to explain what this query does, but just follow with me. I'm going to say select star from users where username equals to colon username, and then I'll put a ending semicolon right there. So what this query essentially means is that we are trying to select all the columns, that is ID, username, email, password, and created at. We're trying to select all those columns from the users table. If I go back there, you'll notice that we have a users table which we created earlier in this tutorial. And then we're saying select star from users where username, that is, we want to select all the columns of a specific table or a specific row where the username is equals to whatever username that we provide. So we're just simply saying that we want to select the ID, the username, the email, the password, and the created time for a user whose username is equal to this value. So this is just the query that we are going to use, but we need to continue writing. Now, if you look at the query, you'll notice that username is equals to colon username. Now, what we are doing right here is called a prepared query. So we don't just want to write this query directly and execute it. What we are doing first is we're saying where username is equals to username, this colon username. Now, this colon username serves as like a unique identifier. So what we're now going to do is we're going to replace this colon username with the actual username variable that we have passed into this place. So this colon username just serves as like a placeholder for something else that we're going to it serves as a placeholder that is going to be replaced by some actual value. So now that we have created this value, what we need to do is we need to prepare this query. So I'm going to create a new variable and call it statement. I'm going to say statement is equals to PDO, and I'm going to say prepare ARE, and in here I'm going to pass in query. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to bind the parameter, that is we need to bind this username to this query. So what I'm going to say is statement, and I'm going to call a method called bind param, and in here I'm going to pass in colon username. I'm going to explain what this does, and after this I'll pass in a comma, and I'll put the username variable there. So what we're simply saying is, okay, in this query that we have created, we want you to bind a parameter. Now this username, this colon username that I said earlier was a placeholder, is also called a parameter. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to bind a specific parameter with an actual value called username. So what it's now going to do is it's now going to put it into this statement. So it's going to say select star from users where username is equals to whatever was passed into this passing as this parameter. So the next thing that we now need to do is we need to execute this statement. So I'm going to say statement execute. Now the execute is also an inbuilt it's also a method coming from right here, this place. So we can just call execute and bind param. Now the next thing that we now need to do is we now need to check to see if anything is actually returned, because as we are running this SQL query, what SQL is going to do is it's going to go to the database and search for records, or it's going to search for entries that match whatever query that we gave it, and it's going to return something back to us. So we need to grab what it is returning. I'm going to create a new variable and call it result, SULT, and I'll equate results to statement, and I'll call another inbuilt method called fetch. ch. And inside fetch, I'm going to pass in something. I'm going to say pdo : fetch stock. So what does this mean? So what we're just trying to say is, okay, after running this query, we want you to grab whatever has been returned back to us as an associative array. So what that means is that whatever is returned back to us from the query, we can just access the values directly by calling either username or email or password. So for example, right now I'm going to return results. So once I return results right here, anywhere we use this function, what we can simply say is our result, and then if we wanted to grab the username, we will just say username. If we wanted to grab the ID, we would say, let me copy that. We would say result of ID. So that is what fetch assoc helps us to do. It fetches the data as an associative array so that we can just directly access the columns by using the names of those columns. So right now, we have written this query and we have executed it and we're returning the result. So what we now simply need to do is we need to call this function, this method or this function that we have created inside our validator class. So what I'm going to do is at the top, I am going to require this file. I'm going to say require once, and I'm going to say user-model.php. Now, once I have done this, it means I can now make use of this get user username function that I had just created. So I am going to say if not empty, that is, if something gets returned here, then we want to execute some specific parameters. So I'm going to say if not empty of get username, and in here note that we have to pass in PDO and username. Now I'm just going to pass in PDO first. So I'm going to say this PDO, and then the next thing we need to pass in is this username. So I'm saying if not empty of get user username, that is if nothing, that is if something is returned from this function which we had created here, then it means that a user with that username actually exists. I'm going to create a new error. I'm going to say errors, and I'll say username exists. And I am going to equate this to an error message of username already exists. So what we now simply need to do is do the exact same thing for the email. So I'm going to copy this function and I'm going to paste this down here. But instead, I'll call it get user email. And instead of username, this is going to be email. And I'm going to say select star from users where email is equals to :email. And I'll change these values to also email. And then I'm returning the result. So that is all we need to change in this function. I'm going to come back again to validate PHP, and I'm going to copy this if statement and paste it. So instead of saying get user username, I'm going to say get user email. I'm going to call the function that we had just created. And instead of passing in the username, I'll pass in the email. And I'll rename this error to email. And I'll change this to email. This is supposed to be username. Username already exists and email already exists. So we have now created two functions called the get user username and get user email. Now these functions just help us to go to the database and check to see if a user with this specific email exists or a user with this specific username exists in the database. It's going to perform this query and return to us the results right here. And we have written two if statements to check if something actually gets returned. And if something actually gets returned, it means that that username and that email exists. So that is basically all we need to do inside this, or those are the if statements that we need to write to perform the validation. Now, the last thing that we need to do is we need to check if we get any specific errors from this validation. Now, if we get errors, what we want to do is we want to return the user back to the register page and render those errors out to the user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save these errors in the sessions, and I'm going to show you how we can grab those errors from the sessions and display them in the register page. So I'm just going to scroll down, and at the bottom here, after all the if statements, I am going to say if not empty of errors, then it means that we have errors if the array is not empty. So if not empty of errors, I am going to store something in the session. I'm going to say $_session, and I'm going to call this sign up errors, and I'm going to equate this to error, or errors, I mean. So what we are simply doing is we're saying that, okay, after performing all these if statements, what we are now doing is saying we want to store all the errors that we have kept inside the array. We want to store those errors in the sessions, so that when we redirect to the register page, we can grab these errors from the sessions, and then after grabbing the errors from the sessions, we can render them out to user. So after saving these errors in the sessions, what we want to do is we want to redirect back to the register page. I'm going to say header, and I'll put location colon then / register.php. I'm going to put my semicolon here, and that should help us with the registration process so far. Now, what we now need to do is test the code and see how we can render these errors out in the register page, so that the users can see errors if we have any. Okay, so before we actually go and render these errors out before we test this code and try to render out those errors in the register.php page, we need to make we need to add a few things. So in our db.php file, what we need to do is we need to start a session. I'm going to say session_start. So anytime we call session_start, if there is no session that exists in if there is no existing session, it's going to create a new session for us. But if there's an existing session, it's just going to include that session in whatever we're doing in that specific PHP page, so that if we want to for example retrieve something stored in the sessions, or if we want to save something into the sessions, we can do that. But if you don't have session_start in your PHP file and you try to perhaps access a session variable, it's not going to work. So I'm just going to put session start in my db.php file, and what we need to do is go back to our validator. Now note that we have been using PDO since. Now PDO has to be passed in from our register-user.php file. Now we need to pass it into our validate class when we call it. Now I'm sure you've noticed that we have written this class, but we haven't actually used this class yet. So I am going to show you how we are going to use the class. So inside the register-user.php file, what we need to do is we need to now call this validate class which we had created. So I'm going to say validate user data, and I'll equate that to new validate. That is this function that we had just created, this class that we created called validate. So we're creating a new instance of this class. Now when we create a new instance, you notice that it gives an error because it's expecting us to pass in the username, email, password, confirm password, and PDO. So that is what we need to do right now. So I'm just going to pass in the username. I'll say username, email, and make sure that you pass it in the order of how the variables are kept in the constructor. So it's username first, email, it's username, email, password, confirm password, and PDO. I'm going to pass it in like that. Username, email, password, confirm password, and then the last thing we need to pass in is PDO. But right now, as we've passed in PDO, it's going to give an error because we don't know what PDO is at this point. So what we need to do is we're trying to reference the PDO variable which we created in our db.php file. You know that we had connected to our database using PDO, PHP data object. So it is this PDO variable or the PHP data object instance that we are going to be using in order to make SQL or database queries with SQL like we did earlier. So we need to pass in this PDO variable into our class which we wrote here. And in order to actually reference this PDO variable, we need to include or import this file into our register.user.php file. So what we just simply need to do is we need to require once. I'm going to say require once, and in here I'll just say db.php. So once I require once db.php, it's going to reference, anytime we say PDO, it's going to reference this specific variable inside our db.php file. So everything should work for us without giving errors. So now that we have created this validate class and we've passed in the data, what we now simply need to do is we need to call the validate data method so that it can perform all this validation on our data, on the user data I mean. I'm going to say validate user data, and I'm going to call the function that we created, and I'll call it validate data. So this is the variable that we created called validate user data, and we equated this to the validate class. Now inside the validate class, we passed in, inside the validate parenthesis class that we just created, we passed in the values. Now after passing in the values, the constructor is just going to take those values and assign them to the attributes of the validate class. And then the next thing we did was we called the validate data for a method which is present in that class. So it's going to perform the validation for us. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to redirect to the login. We need to redirect to the login page. Yes, if the validation works properly. So in our validator class, you notice that at the end we wrote that we wrote some code to check if there are errors. And if there are errors, we want to redirect the person back to the register page to display those errors. But if there are no errors, what we want to do is we want to redirect the person to the login page and display a message saying sign up was successful, proceed to login. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new header method to redirect the person back to the login page. I'm going to say /login.php because we are trying to reference the login.php file that is inside a directory before this one. That is why I'm saying ... Now the next thing that we need to say is we need to die so that we can completely exit out of this file. Now we also need to pass in die in the validator.php in the validator class. Now anytime you don't pass in die, it won't exit the file or exit whatever scope it is in. So we always have to pass in die anytime we are redirecting to a different PHP file. So now that we have written all this code, we need to now actually test it to see if it works. And if you have any question, please don't hesitate to leave it in the comment section and I'm going to reply you. So in order to test if this code works, let's just go to the web browser and refresh. Now I am going to try to enter like correct details. So I'll enter let's just say admin for the username. Email is going to be admin@gmail.com. Then the password, I'm going to enter correct passwords. Let's see if it works, and I'll hit register. Now once I hit register, notice that we were immediately redirected back to the login page. And if I come to the database and refresh, you'll see that we currently have no users. Now that is because we haven't written any code to actually create a user in the database. All we did was write code to validate the data. So what we just want to do now is write some code which is going to create this user in the database. But before we do that, let's just test to see if our validation properly works. So let's say, for example, I enter an email of a username of admin, and I enter that email, and I enter two passwords that don't match. you'll notice that we were redirected back to the register page. Now, what we need to simply work on is displaying error messages in the register page. Now, we're redirected back to this register page because in our validator class, it noticed that the passwords were not the same thing. So when it noticed that the passwords were not the same, it created an error of passwords do not match and saved it into the passwords at the errors array. And then after it noticed that there was an existing error in the errors array, it's redirected back to the register page. So what we need to do is write some PHP code that is going to grab those errors and display them inside the Register.php page. So I want you to go to your includes folder and create a new file, and I want you to call it register-views.php. So once you create it, register-views.php, I want you to just create PHP tags and make sure you don't close it, by the way. So once you've created this register-views.php file, what we need to do is we now need to check to see if we have any errors. And if we have any errors, we want to display them like right around here under this register h1. So I'm going to create a new function and I'm going to call it display, or I'm going to call it render errors. Render errors. Now what we simply need to do here is that we need to check the sessions to see if an error exists. Now we're checking for a specific error. We want to check and see if a session variable of signup_errors exists. So if a session variable of signup errors exists, it certainly means that we have some errors that we got from our register page. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to write an if condition to actually make this check to see if we have this variable in this session. I'm going to say if is set. Now in order to check for a session variable, it's advised to use is set, because if I just say if session, let me just copy this. So and I'll show you what I mean. If I decide to proceed without is set, if I say if session or if $_session and sign up errors, it's going to give an error, because if this variable doesn't exist in the sessions, then it seems like we're trying to access something that doesn't exist. So we say is set to check if it exists first. So if it exists, then it now means that we have errors that exist. If it exists, it means that we had errors from the sign up page. And what do we want to do with these errors? We want to retrieve them. So I'm just going to create a new variable and I'll call it errors. Now equate this to this variable right here. So right now we're just grabbing all the errors in the session and then we are equating it to this errors variable. So what we simply just need to do is write a for each loop that is going to loop through all the errors inside this array and render them out right here. So I'm going to be rendering those errors right here. So I'm just going to come back to my render errors function. And I'm going to say for each, and I'm going to say errors as error. So we're going to be looping through each error inside the errors array, and the error variable is going to serve as the iterator. So what do we now want to do if we have what do we now want to do as we're looping through this error array? What we want to do is we want to echo out the error. I'm going to say echo, and I'm going to create an h2 tag here. I'll create a h2 tag. Let me just close the h2 tag right here. And in here, I just want to echo out the error. I'm going to close this off. I'm going to put in the errors right here. So what we're simply saying is that for every single error that exists inside this array, we want to echo out this error and display it inside the web page. I'm just going to give this a little styling. I'm going to say style is equals to color, and I'll give this a color of fire brick. so that it looks red in a way. So that it looks red to signify that it's an error. So this is an H1 and this is an H2. So I'm just going to save that, and that should be all we need to write here. Actually, that's not all we need to write. The last thing that we need to write is that we need to remove these errors from the session, because after displaying the errors for the user to see, what we now simply need to do is we need to remove these errors, so that even if the user comes back to the register page, these errors won't be displayed because they can only be viewed once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the onset method. It's an inbuilt method that PHP has. So I'm just going to say onset this session variable so that we are not, for example, wasting space. Because if we have displayed these errors once to the user, then there's no need to keep storing the error since we have already displayed it once. So I am going to save this function. And then what I'm going to do is I'll come back to the Register.php page. And then I'm going to come down or go to the top and create some PHP tags. And I'll close it right here. So what we just need to do is we need to say start session. Oh, sorry, session start. I'm going to say session_start. So what we are simply going to do next is, since we want to render out the errors in this specific page, for example, I'm just going to copy this and show you what it will look like. Let me just copy and paste it. Let me close the H2 and I'll say error. If I come and refresh, this is how it's going to look like if we have an error. I'm just going to make sure I center this. So I'll copy this and put it in a center tag. Now, once I paste it, you'll see that the error is now centered. So what I'm going to do is I'll copy this instead, and in the views, I'll put a center tag there. Let me just erase everything. Now paste this here. I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'll render out the error in between the tags. I'll say error, so that when the error is rendered out, it's centered and it has a color of fire brick. So I'm just going to come here and delete that. Now create a new PHP tag. And in here, what we simply need to do is we need to first include this views file, because we are going to be calling this function from this views file. So we need to actually include it into our register.php file first before we can now call the render errors function. So I am going to come down and I'll say require once, and then I am going to say includes /register-views.php. The reason why we're saying includes / is because we are currently in the register.php page, and then the register-views is inside the includes folder. So that is why we are saying includes / that. Now, after doing this, all we need to do is just call the render errors function that we had created in the views. So all we simply need to do right now is just to test this code to see if it works. So I'll go back to the browser and refresh. Now, once I refresh, I'm just going to do the process again. I'm going to enter a username. Let's just say admin. I'll enter an invalid email. But in order to show that the email is invalid, I'm going to come down and let's just change this email field to a type of text to just simulate an invalid email. I'm going to enter admin right here. I'll enter some random thing in the email and I'll make sure the passwords do not match. So once I hit register, you'll notice that we have two errors. Passwords do not match, and please enter a valid email address. So you see that our error messages are being displayed properly. And once I refresh, you'll notice that those errors are gone. Those errors are gone because what we simply did was, after rendering out the errors in the for loop, we just simply remove those errors from the sessions so that they aren't stored there again. If they are constantly stored in the sessions, every time we refresh this page, those errors are going to be constantly displayed. I'm just going to change this to a H4 tag, because those errors were quite, the text was quite large. So I'll put in a valid email now. For example, I'll put in passwords that do not match. And once I hit register, it says passwords do not match. And once I refresh again, you can see that the error is gone. So our validation system works properly right now, and our validation class is working perfectly. So the next step that we need to take is we now need to actually write some code inside the register user PHP file that is going to take all these details and create a new user and save that user to the database. So that is what we are going to do right now. So right now, we are going to be writing some code that is going to help us create and save users to our database. So what we need to do is, you notice that here we are performing the validation on all the data that the user had already entered. So what we simply now need to do is, at this point, before redirecting the person to the login page, what we need to do is create the user in the database first, then redirect to the login page and tell the user that your account was created successfully, proceed to login. So what I'm going to do is I'll go to the user models.php file, and we are going to be writing some SQL query right here, which is going to help us create a new user and save the user to the database using the details that they provided. I'm going to create a new function, function, and I'll call it create user. And in here, inside this function, it's going to take in a few parameters. The first parameter that it's going to take in is PDO. Now, after PDO, the next parameter that is going to take in is, now let's note that let's pass in the data type. So the next thing that is going to take in is the username. So I'm going to say string username, USERNAME. Then the next thing is going to be a string of email, and then the next thing is going to be a string of password. So those are the things that we need to pass into this function. We need to pass in the username, the email, the password, and the actual PDO object. I'm just going to create curly brackets here. Let me zoom in a bit. Now, after doing this, what we need to do is we now need to write our query as usual, which we did up here. So I'm going to be writing an SQL query that is going to take all these details and insert it to the database. I'm going to create a new variable and call it query, and I'll equate this to an SQL statement. So let me put a semicolon here, and I'll say insert into users. That is, we're saying insert into the users table. So we're saying insert into users, and what we need to pass in next is the values that we want to actually insert. So we're going to be inserting the username, the email, the password, which we put here, PWD. So those are the only values that we are going to be inserting: the username, email, and password. The ID is auto-generated for us because we had specified that this is an auto-incremented field, and the created at field is also specified for us because we said that because we gave this column a default value, and the default value is the actual time that the new user is being created. So we're just going to be passing only the username, email, and password. Now note that these values that you pass in, username, email, and PWD, they must match the column names. So username, email, and PWD. So make sure that they match. Now the next thing that we need to do is, after specifying the values that we want to insert, we now need to say values. Actually, I mean after specifying the columns that we want to insert to, then the next thing we need to say is values, then specify the values that we want to actually now insert into these columns. So I'm going to create another parenthesis here, and I'll say colon username, colon email, and colon password. Or instead of saying password, let's change this to colon PWD. So you notice that I couldn't say password right here because it is an inbuilt keyword. So we have to say pwd so that we don't cause issues. So the next thing that we now need to do is we need to prepare this query and bind them to the parameters. Now, these values that we had specified here, they are just very similar to the values that we had put here. They are just parameters which we are going to map to their own specific values, which we defined as parameters in the function. So these parameters that are being passed into the function are also going to be passed to these parameters as the values that we want to assign to the columns. So what I'm simply going to do next is I'll put a semicolon here, because remember, you have to end the lines of a SQL query with semicolon. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable and call it statement. And this is going to be equals to PDO. I'm going to call the prepare method. I'm going to pass in query. So we're just trying to prepare this query and also bind all the parameters and send it to the database so that the query can be carried out. So I'm now going to say statements. I'm going to call the bind param method. I'll say bind param, and in here the first thing I'm going to pass in is username. I'm going to say colon username, and I'll put a comma. I'll pass in the username variable. Now I'm just going to do this 2 more times. So this is going to be email, and then the last thing is going to be password. Now I want you to take note of something. This is going to be pwd. This is going to be pwd, and we're going to replace this with password. Now I'm sure you are going to notice that we are just passing in the plain password that the user entered. Now this isn't very secure, because if you are just going to be saving the password, for example, if I come here and I enter I don't know, testing, and I click register, it's going to save the plain password to the database. Now I'm going to show you how this looks like. So I'm just going to run this for now, and I'm going to show you how to encrypt this password so that if, for example, a hacker gets hold of, I don't know, a database, they won't just see the login credentials of all your users, as that would be very, very unsafe. So the last thing that we just need to say here is statement, and we need to call the execute method. Now that we've done that, that should be all the code that we need to write inside this function. So we're going to come back to our register.php, register.user.php, and then what we need to do is we need to call this create user function, and we need to pass in all these values or all the parameters. So what we need to do now is we need to come here at the top and we need to require it. I'm going to say require once, and in here I'm going to pass in user-models.php. Now I want you to take note of something. If we check our validator.php file, you will notice that we are also requiring once this user-models.php, but we can delete it from here, because if we go back to our register user.php file, we are already requiring it once at the top, and then we are requiring it excuse me, before the validator file itself. So once we require it here, it means that all the methods that are inside this file are already available before we require this validator.php. So it means that when we in validator.php, we can just directly call those methods without any errors occurring. So what we now simply need to do is, after requiring the user models.php file, we just need to call the create user method. I'm going to put the create user method, and then we need to pass in the parameters. The parameters are PDO, username, email, and password. I'm going to pass in PDO, and remember, PDO again is coming from our database file, which we had worked on first at the beginning of this tutorial. I'm going to pass in PDO, and then I need to pass in the username, the email, and then the password. So once we save this, we should be able to test our code and see if it works. I'm going to come over to my Firefox web browser, and I'm going to create a new username, and I'll call it admin, and then the email is going to be admin@gmail.com. The password is going to be, I'm just going to put in the password testing. The password here is going to be testing. Once I hit register user, you'll notice that we were redirected back to the login page. And if I check my database and refresh, what do you know? We have a new entry that was created right here. We have the ID of the user, which is 1 because it's the first user. Then we have the username, which is admin, which we entered. We have the email, and then we have the password. Now notice that the password is just like showing there, testing. Now this is very unsafe, as any hacker that accesses your database can just see that this is the password of this user, and the hacker can just access the account. So what we need to do is we need to work on encrypting the password before actually saving it to the database. So I want you to come to the user models.php file. And so once you are in this file, after calling this prepare method, we need to do a few things. We need to create a new variable and call it options. And then we're going to equate it to a list or an array. Now in this list, we're going to put cost, and then I'm going to equate it to 12. Now I'm going to explain what this is. Now we created an associative array first, and then we said cost is equals to 12. Now the next thing that we are going to do is we need to now hash the password or encrypt it. So we're going to say, I'm going to create a new variable and call it hashed password, and I'll equate this to password hash. Now this password hash is an inbuilt method also in PHP. I'm going to say password hash, then I need to pass in the password that I'm trying to hash first. So I'm going to say password. Now this is coming from this password parameter here. Now the next thing that we need to pass in is password bcrypt. So we're trying to encrypt this password using password bcrypt. This is also inbuilt. Now you can look it up if you want to like understand how it works. It's just an algorithm that helps us to hash passwords. Now the next thing that we need to pass in is options. So let me just explain what options mean. So what this means is that when we are saying cost is equals to 12, what this means is that the higher the number, that is the higher the value of cost, the harder it is to decrypt or to get the encryption of this password. Now the only downside is that the higher the number of the higher the value of this cost, it increases computational need or computational processing. If this was like 5 or 4, it's still secure, but it is less secure than a password that was encrypted with a cost of 12. So when you use a cost of 12, it is more secure, and the downside is that it takes more time to it takes more time and more computation to encrypt the password because it has a higher cost value. So that is just what these options mean, and you can pass in other values into this array also, but it's just cost that are going to be passing it. So basically, when we do this right now, it's going to encrypt our password. Now, instead of passing in password directly here, I'm going to replace it with hashed password. So it's going to encrypt this password that the user has passed in, has typed in, and then it's going to save that hashed password to the database. So once I save that and I come back and try to create a new user, for example, let's say I create a new user and call the user admin2, and the email is let's just say admin@yahoo.com, and let's put a password of same testing and password of testing. Once I save this and I come back to my database and refresh, you'll notice that between these two users, the password here is saying testing, and then admin2's password has been encrypted, and it just looks very weird. It looks like gibberish. So right now we have been able to encrypt this user's password before saving it to database. So we know that the encryption that we did right here using bcrypt worked successfully. Now, after doing all of this, the next step, like I said earlier, is to render out a message in the login.html page saying that your account was created successfully. Proceed to login. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over my includes file, and I'll also create a file called Login.views.php. And I'm just going to open PHP tag right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function. And I'm going to call it render message or render success message. I'm going to call it render success message. And I'm just going to leave it for now. So what we need to do next is that we need to find a way to store a message, a success message that's going to say your account creation was successful. We need you to log in right now, and we need to display that message in the login page. So what we are simply going to do is, just like we did with the sign up, I'm going to come here to the register user.php. And after creating the user, before redirecting the user back to the login, before redirecting the user to the login page, we want to create a new session variable. So I'll say session, and I'll call it login success. And I'm going to equate that to, I'll call it sign up success. And I'm going to equate that to a message saying sign up was successful, or sign up successful. Proceed to login. So what I'm simply doing here is, after the user has been created successfully, we just want to create a new message saying sign up success, and then we want to assign it to a message of sign up successful, proceed to login. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to come to my login views page, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did in my register views. That is, I'm going to check if that message is saved in the sessions. I'm going to come back and I'll write that if condition. I'll say if is set, and I'm going to put a $_session so that I can access that session variable. And I'll say sign up, signup, sign up _ success. So if it is set, it means that the sign up was successful, and then we want to render out the sign up success message. I'm going to say message equals to that, so that I can grab whatever success message it was. Then I need to echo out something. So I need to echo out, I'm just going to come to the register page, and I will copy, I'll go to the register view. Let me copy this, and I'm going to paste it here. Now, instead of Firebrick, I'll just put Dodger Blue, and this is going to be message instead of the error. Now, after rendering out, or after echoing the success message, what we just need to do is we need to do the exact same thing that we did here. We need to unset or remove that session variable, because we have already rendered out the success message to the user. Then there is absolutely no need for us to store that message again, since the user has already seen it. I'm going to call the onset built-in method, and I'm just going to copy this. It's going to delete this session variable. It's going to delete this variable from the sessions, so that we're not wasting space, and so that this user doesn't keep saying this error anytime they visit the login page. So what we simply need to do right now is just call this render success message method in our login.php page. I'm going to open it, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start a new session. Now, we're starting a new session because we are going to require this login views page, and then it is accessing the sessions. So in order to access the sessions, we need to have started a new session. I hope you understand. In order to access a session, we need to actually have a session running before we can access it. So that is why we need to run a session at the top of the page. I'm going to create a new PHP tag, and I'm just going to come here and say session underscore start. Now, after starting the session, I'm going to come over here and I'll create PHP tags again, opening and closing. And then I'm going to require once. I'm going to require once this login views file. I'm going to say includes / login-views.php. And after doing that, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to call the render success message method, which we had just created. So this is just going to help us check the session to see if a success message, a sign up success message is present. Now, if that message is present, it's going to echo out that message. And after echoing out that message, it's going to delete the message from the session so that we can free up space. So we're just going to come over and test it. I'm going to refresh and let's create a new. I'm just going to come over here and delete this first entry. I'm going to say yes. Now I'm going to refresh, and here I'm going to enter a username of admin. I'm going to enter an email of admin@gmail.com, and password, I'll enter that. Testing and password again, I'll enter that. Once I hit register, you'll notice that we now have a sign up success message getting displayed. It says sign up successful, proceed to login. Now we know that our messaging system is working perfectly, and anytime a user signs up and makes a mistake, the errors are getting displayed. And if the user signs up successfully, they get redirected to the login page and the message gets displayed properly. And once I refresh, you'll see that the error has been deleted because we told PHP to unset or remove this session variable from the sessions. So it was deleted immediately. It was displayed in the page. So that is all we're going to do in this section. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to leave it in the comment section and I am going to reply you immediately. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do right now is that we need to wrap this section of code in a try and catch block. Now I'm going to explain why we're doing this, but I want you to just wrap it in a try and except block, and I'll explain why I mean. So the reason why we're doing this is because in between these try and except blocks, we are running a few SQL queries. Like for example, in here, we're trying to connect to the database. And right here at this point, we are trying to make a query to create a new user in the database. Now, something could go wrong within these lines, and something could go wrong in our model where we are trying to make these queries right here. Something could break. So in order to handle this exception, we need to create a try and except block. So we are going to just copy this line right here, and I am going to replace this catch with it. So we are saying we want you to try all of this. We want you to try to require all these files, and then we want you to try to make all the queries. Now, if for some reason a query that is made in our modules file is wrong, or if it breaks, then what we want to do is we just want to catch that exception, that PDO exception, and then we want to catch the error. We want to replace this with let's just call it SQL query failed. So if for some reason whatever query we run here fails, it's going to throw an exception. It's going to catch the exception and it's going to throw it, then exit the program. So that is why we need this try and catch block. So after doing that, we need to now work on the login section of this project. So we have worked on the logout on the sign up section. Now we need to work on the login section. So I will just close the register.php file and open my login.php file. Now, what we need to do is we need to create another file which we are going to point the form action to. Now, let's just call this login-user.php. Now, just create the PHP opening tag. And after creating this PHP opening tag, I'm going to come to the actions of this form, and I'm going to point it to this login.php file, login user.php. Let's just make sure that the file is created correctly inside the includes directory. So once I've moved the file into the includes directory, I can now properly say login user.php. Now, after doing this, we need to again make sure that this form has the proper name attribute. So I can see that there are just two fields, username and password. I can see that this has a name attribute of username, and this has a name attribute of password. So it means that this is working. This is going to work properly. So what I will do is I will just go to the login user.php file, and I'm just going to check for an incoming post request, because when we submit this form, a post request is going to be sent to this file. So what I'm going to write is what I'm going to write is an if condition, and I'll say if $_server, and I just want to check if a post request is coming. So I'll say request_method is equals to post. Now, if a post request is coming in, we will just execute whatever code is here. But if a post request isn't what is coming in, then we just want to redirect this person back to the login view, because a user should only be redirected to this page if they submitted the login form. So I'm going to say header location should be /login.php. Oops. And then I'll put my semicolon here. I'm going to say die, just to exit out of this file. Now, if a post request comes in, what we want to do is the exact same thing that we did here. We're just going to get the username that the user entered, and then we're also going to get the password. I'm just going to copy those and paste them here that we did here. Now I am going to again create those try and catch blocks. I'm going to say try here and then catch, and in here I'm going to say PDO exception, and I'll say $E. You know what, I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to replace my catch with it. So we are going to be making some queries also inside this catch block, and we want to make sure that if for any reason one of our queries has an error or breaks, we're going to catch that error and then throw it. We're going to display or throw that error right here. So what's the first thing that we're going to do is that we need to include a few files. Now remember that we had created a validator.php file, and then we created a validate class in order to help validate user data when signing up. Now we also need to create a different class for validating a user when they are trying to log in. So I'm just going to rename this class that we had created here, and I'll call it register validator. And then I'm going to copy this, and I'll replace this validate with register validator. So now I am going to create a different class inside this validator file, and I'm going to call it login validator. I'm going to say class login validator, and I'm just going to leave it empty for now. So what we need to do is come back to our login.php file, and we need to include a few files or require ones for a few files. So I'm just going to copy all of this because we are going to be using all of these files again, because we are going to need the database files where we are going to require PDO in order to make queries to our database using SQL. We're also going to require the user models because we would be performing some validation that requires getting information from the database. And also, we're going to be needing this validator class because we're going to be needing this validator file because we're going to write custom validator class inside this file, which is going to help us validate some things. So now that we have imported or now that we have put these files or required these files inside our login user.php file, what we now need to talk about is the different kinds of validations that we are going to implement in this login section of this course. So what we need to first check for is we need to ensure that the form is filled properly. That is, we need to ensure that the user entered a username and a password. So we are going to add some validation for that. We are also going to check if a username with if this username as the user types in actually exists. That is, we want to make sure that the details that the user is entering essentially exist. So we're going to check if the username exists, and if it exists, we are now going to check if the password that the user entered is actually correct. So how do we do that? We are just going to come over to our validator class, and I'm just going to copy this. We're going to create an attribute, private username, and I'm just going to paste another one. This is going to be password. And then after doing this, I will create a constructor. Now, after creating this constructor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in two parameters which we are going to assign to this attribute right here from the constructor. So I'm just going to grab this from here instead of having to write it again. And then I'll do the same thing, but instead I'll change this to password. And then I'm going to assign these parameters to these values. And I'm going to do this by saying this, and then username equals to username, and this password is equals to password. So right now, when we create a login validator class, what we are going to do is we're going to pass in these values, username and password, and they are going to be assigned to these private variables or attributes right here at the top. Now, the next thing that we need to do is, like we did before, we need to create a validate data method, which is going to help us validate whether this user is actually correct user. I'm going to create this function, and at the top, as usual, I'm going to create an errors array where we can store all the errors. So for example, if the username is wrong, we're going to store the error that the username is wrong. If the password is wrong, we're going to store the error that the password is wrong. I'm just going to create this array right here. Now, the first thing that we need to check for is to make sure that the form is filled. So I'm going to write an if condition right here. And I'm going to say if empty of this and username, or empty of this password. Then if the username is empty or the password is empty, then it definitely means that the user didn't input these fields. So what we're now going to simply say here is that we want to create a new error. I'm going to say errors, and the key is going to be in, or what did I call it here? Incomplete form. So I'm just going to copy this, and I am going to come down here and paste it. So we're going to create a new error that says please fill all the fields. Now this is going to help us check if the user filled the username and the password field. Now, the next thing that we need to check for is if the username is actually correct. Now, remember that in our models file, if I open it right now, in our models file, we had created a method called getUserUsername. So, and this method just helps us to check the database if there's a user with the username that we specify, if there's a user with that specific username in the database. So what we are going to do is we are going to make use of this function in our validator class right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this validator class can access the user models class and the user models file so that it can then access this function. Now, if I come to my login user.php, you will notice that I first required the database, then I required the models, and then I required the validator class itself. Since I required the models before the validator class, and I know that the getUserUsername function is inside this models class, then it means that as I am requiring this file, I am also kind of like importing the functions. So the function almost like, not even almost like, the function exists as at this stage of importing this file before importing a validator PHP file. So it means that we can directly make use of the getUserUsername method here. Now, if we go back to the getUserUsername method, remember that it just checks the database to see if a user with that specific username exists, and then it returns that user back to us. So we can make use of this. I can just write an if condition to say if not empty, of, or instead, let's just say if empty of get user username of this username. Now you can see that we are able to call this get user username method because the user models.php file was required before this validator.php file. So it's going to work properly. So I'm going to come over here right now to validator.php, and I will scroll up and just copy this PDO attribute right here, and I'm going to paste it. So that also means that we have to pass it in as a value into the constructor. I'm just going to copy this, paste it, and in here I'm going to say this of PDO is equals to PDO. So right now we are going to be storing that PDO object inside this class. So what that now means is that I can just directly call that PDO object. So I can say this and say PDO, and I can put a comma, and I can just pass that object into the get user username method. So it means I can pass in the PDO object and the username properly to this get user username method. So right now we are just simply saying if empty, that is if this method does not return anything, then it means that that username that the user entered is wrong because there is no user that exists with that specific username in our database. So I'm just going to copy this and display an error, and I'm going to name this error invalid username, and then I'm going to display an error of invalid username entered. Let me just put the quotes well. I'll say invalid username entered. So right now we have successfully written code that is going to help us, or we have written code, we haven't tested it yet. We have written code that is going to help us make sure that we can verify whether the username is correct or not. Now we need to also do the same thing for the password. We need to make sure that whatever password the user enters is a correct password. So what I'm going to do right now is I am going to create a different if condition. So in order to check that the password is correct, what I'm just going to do is I'm first going to remove this method that we called here, and I'm going to explain why we are doing this. But first, let's create a variable, and I'm going to call this variable user. and I will equate it to this line and this calling that I had just copied. Now I'm going to pass that in here. So you can see it's the exact same thing. I just separated out where I called the function. Now notice that this is also going to work because in the method, we're just returning that user back to where function was called from. So it's going to be returned here. So the next thing now that we need to do is check if the password is correct. So since we already have the user object right here, it means that we can get this user's password and then we can compare it with what with what the current user that is trying to log in. We can compare it with what they entered. Remember that when we wrote this get user username method, when we were returning the result, we weren't just returning the username. In the SQL query, we said select star from users where username is equals to that. Now, when we say select star, it just simply means that we are trying to say select all the columns. That is, select ID, username, email, password, and created at. So we're saying select all these columns, and then we're going to be working with all those columns. So that is what select star means. When we returned results, it essentially returned all these values in as an associative array, because we said fetch we said PDO fetch a sock. So now if we would like to get this username, we could just say result and then user name. But I'm going to show you how we're going to make use of this. So right now I'm just going to come over to the validator class. So what I am going to do right now is I am going to write an if condition to check if the username, if the password is correct. So I'll write an if, and I'm going to say if not empty of user, that is if the user exists and if like a user was actually returned from this method that we wrote here. So if not empty of user, or we could just shorten it simply and say if user. And since we shortened it and said if user, we can also remove this empty instead and say if not user. So you could use whichever one you wanted. So if user simply means that if like this user is equated to something, if something was returned from this method. When we're saying if not user, it simply means that if nothing was returned. So we're saying if user, and this is where we're now going to verify if the password match each other. And we are going to be using an inbuilt method that PHP also has. I'm going to say if user and not password verify. As you can see, it's an inbuilt method. And the first thing that we're going to pass into this method is the username, the password that the user just imputed. I'm going to say this, and I'll say password. And then the next thing that we need to pass in is the actual password of the user that the person is trying to log in as. I'm going to say user, and I'm going to pass in pwd. Now, the reason why I can say user then pwd is because if you remember, this user variable is equated to this function. Now, this function goes to the database and grabs that user from the database, that user row, and returns it here as an associative array. So that is why we can grab the user's data here and just say user then pwd. The reason why we can say pwd is because that specific row is called pwd. So now this inbuilt method is just simply comparing what the user just entered and the actual password of the user to see if they match. So this function says if user, that is if a user with that specific username exists and the password that the user the current user entered does not match what is saved in the database, then it means a wrong password was entered. So I'm just going to copy this line and I'm going to say invalid password. And I'll just say invalid password entered. Now, if you have any question, please feel free to ask in the comment section. I'll just go over this again. I said if user, That is, if a user with this specific username exists and not password verified. When I say and not, we're just trying to say and if this password verify cannot verify that the password that was just entered, if it can't verify that the password that was just entered and the password that is in the database match each other. So if they don't match each other, then it means that this condition is going to be true. If the passwords don't match each other and if a user with that specific username exists, then it means that this if condition is going to be true overall, and then it means that the user just imputed a wrong password. So those are all the things that we basically need to check for to ensure that our login system is working perfectly. Now, the last thing we just need to do is we need to write an if condition to check if there are errors. I'm going to say if errors, just like we did here. But here we said if not empty errors. So let's just follow the same paradigm. I'm going to say if not empty of errors, then I'm going to open my curly bracket. So what's the way now want to do? If there are errors present, then it means that we had some logging in errors. So I'm going to save it to the sessions. So I'm going to say $_session, and I'm going to save a new session variable called login errors. And then I'm going to equate that to errors. So we're just saying that we want to store whatever login errors that user has inside the session. Now, after storing it in the sessions, we just want to redirect back to the login page. I'm going to say header, then location, /login.php. Now, after doing that, we're just going to die so that we can exit this file. So what this is just going to do is if there are errors, it's going to save those errors it's going to save these errors inside the sessions, and it's going to redirect the user back to the login page. Now, after redirecting the user back to the login page, what we just want to do is make sure that those errors get displayed right here when they are redirected back to the login page. So it's the same thing that we did in the sign up view that we are going to do here also. So I will just go to my register view and I will copy this entire line. And I'll go back to my login view. I believe I created one right here. So I'll go to my login view right now, and I am going to make a few changes to this method. So this was an error. I was supposed to put curly brackets here. So that's one of the first changes that I am going to make. Now, the second change that I am going to make is that I'm going to put this other if condition, and I am going to rename this method to render message. And I'll copy this, and you'll notice that there's already an error showing in the login page. Now, I'll explain why I'm doing this. I'll copy this and instead replace it with render message. So what I am simply doing here is that I just want to create one function that can check if we have either a sign up success error or a login error. I'm going to go back to my validator.php file, and I'll copy this. I'll copy this entire line, and I'll go back to my views and replace it with the login errors. So we're just saying if there are login errors saved in the session, then we would like to first of all loop through all these errors and display them, and then remove the errors from the session. So it's the exact same thing that that we did in the register view that we are doing here. So it's just going to grab those errors and it's going to display them here. So I just wrote two if statements so that I don't have to separate the two message checking into two functions. So I just made it into one function called render message, and this render message checks for incoming errors or incoming sign up success messages or incoming login errors messages. So now that we've done that, we need to head back to the login user.php. Now what we now actually need to do is we need to make use of this class that we had just created. We need to make use of the login validator class. I'm going to come here and create a new variable, and I'll call this validate user. And I'm going to equate this to a new login validator class. Now notice that it's showing an error because we need to pass in the parameters. We need to pass in the username, the password, and then PDO. I'm going to first pass in the username, the password, and then lastly I'll pass in PDO. So once I pass all those values in, you should see that the error has appeared. So right now what we just need to do is we need to call the validate data method. I'm just going to come down and say validate user, and I'll call the method of validate data. Now if all this validation if the validation that is done passes successfully, that is, if there are no errors generated, then it means that we are just going to redirect the user to the login page. I'm just going to say header, and I'm going to say location, and this is going to go to the index.php page. But note that it has to be // because index.php is in the previous directory. And I am going to die, or not me, I mean I'm going to kill the code here so it can redirect successfully to the index.php page. Now note that there's also something that we want to do. Now at this stage, if we are logging the user in, what we want to do is we want to store the user data in the sessions. So we validated that, okay, this is a valid user. We want to log the user in. But how do we create a way to know that this user is logged in? What we are simply going to do is that we are going to save that data inside the sessions, so that we can access the user data anytime we want to. And we can do this, and doing this is also going to help us know that, okay, this user is logged in. What I'm going to do is I am going to slightly tweak the validator.php. I'm going to tweak this login validator method. Now remember that we had created this variable here called user, and we equated it to this specific line right here, which is this function that is being called, and this function just returns to us the user data. I'm going to tweak this a bit, and I will copy this line, and I will create a new function, and I'm just going to call it get user data, and I'm just going to simply return TURN. I'm going to simply return this value. So what I can now do is I can copy this method, and I can say user is equals to this, and I can reference this method. So what this is simply just going to do is, when I'm saying user is equals to this function, I'm calling a function in this specific class. So it's going to come to this function, and it's going to run this function. And this function just basically returns the get user username function call, because right here from this model function that we created, it returns the user data. So it's going to be returned here, and then this function is then going to return it to where it is being called. So the reason why I am doing this is because we want to be able to access this user data right here in our login user.php file, and you'll see how this is going to work. So in order to save the user data in the sessions, I'm just going to say $_session, and I'm going to create a new session variable called user, and I'm going to equate it to validate user, and I'm going to call get user data. So what I just simply did here is that in the sessions of our website right now, or in our web app, I am going to store the user data, and I am getting the user data from calling the get user data method from our validator.php file, which comes from my login validator class. So this is just going to help. This is just going to help return the user data, which we are getting also from this file. So if you have any question, please just leave it in the comment section, and I'm going to reply. So I'm just going to save this file. So at this point right now, we have the user data being saved in the sessions. So after saving the user data in the sessions, we're just going to redirect the person back to the login to the index.php. So right now, all we simply just have to do is test to see if this code works. So I am going to come over to my login.php. So let me try to enter wrong username and wrong password. Once I click login, you can see that it says invalid username entered. So let's say I enter a correct username, for example. I can see there's a username of admin2. I'm just going to enter admin2, but enter a wrong password. Once I hit submit, you can see that it says invalid password entered. So the messages are being displayed properly. Now, if I now decide to enter the correct username and the correct password, once I hit login, notice that we are being redirected to the index.php page. So our code is working perfectly right now, and we have been able to work on the login section successfully. Now, how do we actually know that the user is logged in? All we did was just display that all we did was just store the user data in the sessions. But how do we make use of that user data? So I'm going to come over to my index.php page, and right here I'm just going to echo out something. I'm going to create PHP tags right here, and in here I am just going to echo out the current logged in user's username to the screen. So I'm going to say echo, and before I do that, I need to start a session so that I can access my session variables. So I'm going to create a new PHP opening and closing tag here, and I'm going to say session start. So I'm just going to say echo, then I'm going to say session, and in here I'm going to pass in the user, and what I want to get is the username. I'm going to say user of username. Now I'm going to explain how we're able to do this, but just save it and refresh. Now once you refresh, you can notice that admin2 is being printed out. So let me just put a line break here. I'm going to first echo a break tag. So once I refresh this, you'll notice that there is admin2 being printed out, and I should also be able to get the user's email. I'm going to echo the same thing, but I'll change this to email. Now once I refresh, you can see that the email is being displayed. So how exactly am I able to access the username and the email? Now remember that when we logged the user in, we saved the user's data in the session. So we said $_session, and we stored the user's data. And we stored the user's data right here in this session, and we gave it a key of user. So when we say user, we are just simply accessing when we say user, we're just simply accessing the user data. If, for example, I decide to go to the index.php page, and I just say we want to echo just user. In fact, let me remove this line. Let's say we want to echo just user. When I refresh, you'll notice that it just says array. Now, the reason why it says array is because if we go back to the login user.php, yeah, when we were storing it, we're getting the validate user, we're getting the user data from this login validator. And from the login validator class, if we go into it, the get user data in this function, you can see that we're actually getting the user data from the get user username field function, And I explained that all this is being returned as an associative array. So that is why when we echo out user, we are just getting an array. I'm going to go back to the index file right now, just undo those changes so that when we refresh, we can see the user's username and then we can see the user's email. So right now we've been able to build a login and logout system successfully. Now the last thing that we need to do, or one of the last things anyway, is that we need to work on logging out a user out of our website. So this link right here, logout, exists, but it doesn't actually work. So I'm going to show you how to make this work right now. So right now I am going to create a new file and I'll call it Logout.php. So once I do that, let me just zoom in a bit here. So once I do that, I'm just going to create my PHP tags. And then the first thing I want to do is I want to get the current session that is running. I'm going to say session underscore start. Now, once I get that session, what I just want to do is unset the session. So I'll say session underscore unset. So after calling session underscore unset, the last thing I'll just say is session underscore destroy. So what I have done right now is I got the current session. I ran unset and then I am just destroying it. So what it's going to do is it's going to go in and destroy our sessions, and every single thing that was saved in our sessions is going to get removed. So including the user data or any other thing that was saved in the sessions. So all the session variables are going to get destroyed or deleted. So right now what we now need to do is after logging out the user, we would like to obviously redirect the user back to the login page or wherever you want to redirect the user to. I'm going to create, I'm going to say header, and I'm going to say the location of after logging out this user is going to be the Login.php page. Now note that the logout page is in the same, the logout file is in the same file where my login.php file is. So that's why I'm just saying login.php, because they're in the same directory. Now after doing that, I will just call the die method to exit out of the program. So all we have to do right now is test it. So I'm going to come to my index page, and instead of just putting hash here, I'm going to replace it with my logout.php file. I'm just going to type logout.php. Now once I save that, come back to my browser and refresh. Once I press logout, you can see that I am being brought to the login page. Now there is something that I want to show you. If I try to go to my home page right now, let's say I try to go to my home page right now, you will notice that I can see hello world and logout. But you notice that the username and the email are not being displayed like we wrote here. They are not being displayed because we had already destroyed the sessions when we logged out. Now it begs the question of, so if we are logged out, should we be able to access the home page? The question is no. So if you would like to build a functionality where you don't want users to access a specific page if they are not logged in, then we can just do that right away. So in the index.php page, I'm just going to write this at the top instead of writing it in a different file, because we already have like a lot of files right now. So I'm just going to write a simple, if condition that does something. I'm going to say if is set, or if not is set, and then what are we going to check for? We're going to say $_ session, and in here I'm going to pass in user. So what we're simply saying here is that if a user key, if a user's variable does not exist in the sessions, that is, if it is not set, that is, if it does not exist in the sessions, then obviously it means that no user is logged in, because the only way that this user variable exists in the sessions is if they have been logged in. And when they are logged in, that user variable gets set and created immediately they log in. So if it's not set, it means that they are not logged in. So if this is not set, then we want to redirect the person to the login page. So I'm going to say header, and I'm just going to say location, and I'll say colon login.php, and I'll put my semicolon right here. Then I'm just going to call the die method. Now this is going to this should work. So once I save it and I come back and refresh, you'll notice that we are being brought back to the login page. If I try to visit the index.php page and I hit run, you'll notice that we are being redirected back to the login page. But the moment I log in, I'll just say admin2 and enter the password. Once I log in, you'll notice that we can now visit the home page because we are logged in. Now, I want you to also notice something. If we try to visit the, let me just copy that. If we try to visit the login page, for example, if I say Login.php, you'll notice that we can see the login page even though we are currently authenticated. So right now, what I am going to do is I'm going to copy this and I'll come to my Login.php page and I'll paste this at the top. But instead, I will say if is set, that is, if the user is logged in, then we would like to just redirect the person back to the index page. That is, if the user is logged in, then there is absolutely no need for us to see the login page because like there's no need. I'm just going to save that. And once I refresh, you'll notice that I'm being redirected back to the login page. Now I'm just going to also copy this code and I'll paste it in my Register.php page, because if I'm logged in, then there's no need for me to see my if there's no need for me to see the register page if I am logged in. So right now, if I try to visit the register page, for example, if I go to Register.php, you notice that I'm being redirected to the index. But if I log out and I try to visit the index.php page, you notice that I cannot view it because I have been logged out. So that is all we are going to talk about in this video, guys. I hope you learned a lot from this video and I hope this was helpful. And if you have any question, please just leave it in the description. And if you want to get the code to this course, just be rest assured that there is going to be a repository that is going to be linked down in the description of this video. So thank you for watching this video and I will see you in the next one.